Thank you for having me provide you with this information on the League's work, the United Nations, and especially what the United Nations does in terms of climate. I was going to first just give a brief overview of the League's work with the UN, just because I know a lot of people don't realize that the League has been involved in the UN at all. But even before the League, the UN was created, the League was advocating for its creation and supported its creation in 1945. And then immediately after that, a member of the League was the chair of the committee that established the Commission on Women. And this is an organization that's now known as UN Women. And they do various things every year. So further in the 40s, the League's advocacy chair, Eleanor Roosevelt, was also the chair of the committee that created the UN's Human Rights Declaration. And this declaration, as you all well know, is very important, and it's playing a strong role in the UN's work with climate also. So it has its role in most of, if not all, the UN's work. Then more recently, we had the League's observer to the UN, Marjorie Cohen, was advocating for the inclusion of the girls' human rights. And then from this, the UNICEF created the Working Group on Girls that looks and makes comments on various aspects of girls. And then they also established the International Day of the Girl. So that's a bit of history of the League's work with the UN. And today we have these 6 observers. Connie Sensor is the chief observer. She's in New Jersey. And then there's 3 other members of the Observer Corp who live in New York City, and then one who's in Vermont, which is also not very far from New York and is easy to get to observe what goes on in New York City. So they all have permanent passes to go in and out of the UN and observe a wide variety of events that happen at the UN. And then the last person is myself. I'm in Portland, and I'm the observer that's just looking at climate issues. So that's all I do. And because the climate area of the UN is based in Bonn, Germany, most of what I do is virtual, or every once in a while I do get to go to a meeting, but for the most part it's virtual. So the League has accreditation at the UN's Economic and Social Council, and I'll tell you a bit more about this later, but this is where the climate work falls into. And so this organization includes the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization, the World Meteorology Organization. And then we're involved with the UN Women Group. Every year they have this conference on the status of women, which League members can attend, and it usually happens in March, and it's been virtual for the last year, so maybe it will be in person next March. And then there's the UN work, which falls under a treaty, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I'll go into this in more depth in a minute. The UN has these things they call the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are goals that are long-term goals, and they provide some goalposts for the UN to strive for. And I've just listed 6 of them here. And you can see from the titles of these goals that they overlap with most of our positions. In fact, I think all of the sustainability goals match up with one of our advocacy positions in the League. So quite close correlation. So before I go into depth about the climate work, I wanted to sort of give you an overview of how the UN's bureaucracy, if you may, is laid out, because it's quite complex. And I don't intend you to can be able to read all the details on this slide, but all of these, the lines on this chart are separate agencies and departments and offices that the UN, that fall under the UN itself. Over on the left side here are what the UN calls the principal organs. So we have the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, which is the main administrative bit, and then the International Court of Justice and what's called the Trustee Council. So in the General Assembly, we're involved in the UN Environmental Program. UNICEF is under this. The UN Women is under the General Assembly. And then under the Economic and Social Council, we're involved in the agencies that I listed before. One thing that allows us as being part of the Economic and Social Council is that we have this accreditation, which allows us to make statements to the UN, or like advocacy statements, which they call interventions in UN parlance. And they also will come to us for advice if on whatever issue they're working on. For example, in the last few years, one of our members, the previous chief observer, Rosalind Quiche, was working on human trafficking. And she had a lot of knowledge in that. And the UN came to her and asked her for advice on this area. So we have that capability to do that under this Economic and Social Council, which part of the climate work falls under. So now to turn to the UN's work on climate. Back in the mid 80s or so, the General Assembly came to realize that they really need to have more information on what was happening to the climate system. So they formed this thing called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, and that falls under the UN Environmental Program and also under the World Meteorology Organization. So the environmental program is more of a policy body creating policy, while the meteorology organization is an organization that is a coordination body for both meteorology agencies around the world and also oceanographic agencies. So it sort of coordinates data exchanges, making sure that satellite data from one country can be used by another country. And it's kind of that kind of a body. So it's coordinating the scientific information between different countries, while the environmental program is more policy oriented. So the panel met and created this first assessment report coming out of the IPCC and gave that back to the General Assembly. And then the General Assembly realized, yes, we really do have a problem with the climate. And so a treaty was created, and the treaty is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a treaty under the General Assembly, and has now been signed by over 190 members, including the United States, which signed it under George H.W. Bush in 1992, and it's been ratified by the Senate. So the goal of this treaty is the stabilization of greenhouse gases in the concentration in the atmosphere, to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And we still have not reached that goal, but we're certainly trying hard. So one thing I'd like to point out is that this treaty, we have never withdrawn from it, even though the last administration didn't want us to do any climate work. We've always been part of the negotiations that fall underneath this treaty. So, let's see, yeah. So this panel is currently on its 6th assessment cycle. They're charged every 5 years or so to create these 3 main reports. One is the physical basis that was released in August of this year. And then there's 2 others, the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability Report and a Mitigation of Climate Change Report. These 2 will come out sometime next year. And they're just as important as the physical basis report, but they certainly get a lot less attention in the media for some reason, but they certainly are important. And then every once in a while, the UN Convention on Climate Change, the overarching treaty, decides they want another report on one thing or another. And recently they have produced the 2 reports I've listed here. So there was a report 2 years ago that they released about how global warming under a scenario of a threshold of 1.5 degrees C compared to warming of 2 degrees C average over the whole globe. And then the other report they asked to be produced was one on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. So they focused on these 2 regimes on the Earth, how these particular areas were changing in these new climate regimes. And then the 3rd one I list is ongoing. So this report hasn't been issued and it's a task force. So I don't know whether or not a report will come out or not, in the same way as the others are these complex reports. This is on looking at national greenhouse inventories and determining in a consistent way what those inventories are for different countries. So how does the process work on this panel? So this chart shows you the layout and structure of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. At the top, we have the World Met Office and the UN Environmental Program, which are kind of generally overseeing the process and helping with the administration of the process. Then there's the plenary and the bureau, and this is where the member states have representatives. So it's the decision-making body of an approval portion of the IPCC. It's the member states' representatives to these 2 things, and there's over 190 countries that participate in this plenary process. And then the Secretariat, that's just the administration bit of the program. And then there's an executive committee that decides certain things to keep the things moving. And the executive committee is made up of the heads of each of the working groups below it. So the working groups are the groups that reflect which report they're working on. So on the right, I've just listed out which countries the chairs and vice chairs are from for each of these areas. And the IPCC and the UN in general tries to make a broad representation and distribute the work across all different countries. So that currently the chair of the IPCC is from Korea, and the vice chairs are from Mali, Brazil, and the US. In particular, the US representation, the representative her name is Co Barrett. She's a civil servant, a senior advisor for climate at NOAA. So usually the other people, the other co-chairs, are usually some sort of civil servant within their country. And then for the working groups, there's France and China are chairs of the first working group, Germany and South Africa chair the second group, UK and India the third, and Japan and Peru chair the task force. So there are also one other important person from each country that has a role, and these are called the national focal points. And this is the person that handles the formal communications between the IPCC and the country. And that person is a civil servant again, Trig Talley in the US State Department, who is been involved with climate work for quite a long time and has been part of negotiations in the climate area too. So we have these country representatives on these working groups, but the actual work is done by the authors that they find and the contributors and the reviewers. And these are usually the scientists, social science people that come from various different areas in a country. They could be academics, they could be from an NGO if there's some sort of expertise. So there's a broad range of these authors. On the right here is a timeline of how each report gets created and what sort of approval happens in the process. So initially there's a scoping that experts that a government and observer organizations nominate that created an outline. So these might be academics, and they sort of create an outline that then goes to the panel, the IPCC panel, which is the governmental representatives, and they approve this outline. So once the outline of whatever report it is they're working on gets approved, then the authors are chosen through a nomination process. The authors are selected, and then over the next 2-3 years, they actually write the report. And they create a first draft. It goes out for review by the governments and experts. And at that time, then when it comes back, they have to, the authors then respond to the comments that are made. It's really similar to environmental review, the EIR process in California. You know, you have this time period where you can make comments, and then the authors are required to respond to all the comments. And so finally, a final draft is created, and along with that is what's called a summary for policymakers. So the summary, the report may be 200 pages, and so a summary may be 20-30 pages long. And it's summarizing the major points of the report. And then it goes back to the panel, which is, this is the process that happened for the physical report in August. It went back to the panel, and they spent 2 weeks going pretty much line by line through that summary for policymaker document and modifying the language, agreeing to, you know, various points in the summary until they finally had agreement amongst the panel, which is the governmental representations, these 190 some people. And then then it was approved, and then it can be published, and that's what came out in August. So one thing to note about the authors, the panel looks for a range of expertise in scientific, technical, and socioeconomics. They also want a balance in terms of gender and geographic representation. And the gender aspect is a recent addition to the IPCC process. So it hasn't been in there that long, but it's a good development. And then there needs to be representation among the authors from developing and developed and economically transitioning countries. So you can get a broad sense of what's happening around the world, and feedback amongst the authors. And there's also they try to get a mixture of authors that have experience and don't have experience with the IPCC process, so that there's you're not always relying on the same people, and you get new blood into the process. So the important thing to know is that the summary for policymakers is what is approved at the by the IPCC itself. It's not the underlying report, although there's been a time when they've had feedback into it. And that it's the summary that's the important thing for the language. So each report is an assessment of the relevant scientific, technical, and socioeconomic information. It is not, they don't do science. They're just review, it's just a review of the previous 5 years of science that have happened since the last report was written. And priority is given to peer-reviewed literature, but sometimes you can have non-peer-reviewed literature. For example, reports from governments. Our energy department may have a report they've written about the various different sectors and how large they are on for energy use. So that report may provide some information that can be included into the IPCC report. I already said that the full reports aren't approved. It's just the summary for policymakers that's approved. And then there's various levels of endorsement depending on what report it is they're reviewing. And for these assessment reports, it's either they approve it or they don't approve it, and it's approving the summary for policymakers. So then I wanted to go into what's in this 6th assessment report a little bit. And the next few slides I've actually taken from a slide deck that the IPCC provides. And it's quite helpful. So the strongest statement that they come out with in this new report is that it's unequivocal that the humans have been influencing what's happening with our climate. This language, I think, is the strongest it's ever been. And so 190 some countries agreed to that statement in the report. So that's quite important and quite forceful. And some of the things that they found is that the CO2 concentration is the highest in at least 2 million years. Sea level rise is the rate it's rising is the fastest in the past 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice is the lowest in 1,000 years, and then glaciers are retreating faster than they've done over 2,000 years. So included in these reports are estimates of what might happen under future, what the globe might look like under future temperature rises. And these are all simulated changes, and they're usually averages over, I don't know, something 15, 20 different climate models that countries around the globe run these simulations. So they take everybody's simulation and average them together, and you get this picture. So one thing to note with this figure is that a change at 1.5 degrees, at 2 degrees, and at 4 degrees for the global average is that everywhere the temperature is warming, but not equally. At the left side, the 1.5 degrees world, you have a really strong signal and strong warming at the Arctic, and a smaller degree of warming the rest of the globe. But as you move to the right here, you can see that all areas are getting warmer and warmer. And most importantly, the poles in the 4-degree world are strongly warming and heating up. So I'm not sure. The other thing is that these models are now getting more and more detailed. So they're all run out on various kinds of grids. They're like weather models. And so these grids are getting finer and finer. So when I first started looking at these models, they were at quite large cells. So maybe 10-degree resolution, and now they're down to like less than a degree of resolution. So a degree is about 100-kilometer square box. So that it's getting smaller and smaller and taking more and more computer time, etc. And there's more processes that are involved now in these models. In the beginning, the ocean was just a simple level, and now there's a complex model of the ocean included in these climate models. The other thing that this report contains are more information at the regional scale, so that in these figures, it's where hot extremes are happening. So each hexagon, and the US is represented by these 3 hexagons in the middle here. And this is the Western North America is between Canada and Mexico and over to about Colorado or so. You can see that throughout the globe, there's extremes are found in all the areas that are red, and they don't have enough information to say whether or not the extreme is observed in the areas that aren't red. The other thing it notes is that whether or not they have high confidence that the extreme was caused by human contribution to that extreme. So in the Western North America, there's 2 dots, meaning they have a medium confidence that humans have contributed to the extremes that are being seen. In Canada, there's high confidence. In the northern latitude, most of Europe, in fact, they have a high confidence in those extremes. So they also did the same thing for drought. You can see in the Americas that the Western North America, where we all live, that there's been an increase in the number of droughts, but there's still just a medium confidence that those droughts are caused by humans. And I think that means that the information we have about droughts has not we don't have long enough time series to tell whether or not it's above the background noise of the variability in the climate, but we're certainly getting there. So we still have work to do with finding out more about the droughts. So this information is all based on information or scientific reports that have been made that have been done by scientists in the previous 10 years. So none of this is done by this group of people. So if you had a lot of people working on looking at drought in the North America sector, you can say more about it than if you only had one person looking at the information in the eastern part of the US. So part of the information here is that we may need to study what's happening in certain areas more to get stronger confidence in what we're seeing. And then the last chart is the increase in heavy precipitation, or I'd like to think about it as flooding events. And you can see in the North America area that the eastern and central part of North America, there's been more information and more study done to say that, yes, we are seeing more heavy precipitation, and we have a medium confidence that heavy rainfall is caused by humans and the influence of humans on the climate. So now, a lot of the heavy precipitation, there's either a lack of data or a lack of study for a lot of the global areas. So you could probably say, yeah, maybe we need to look at what's happening in South America more for the next set of reports. So the next two slides, I've just summarized a bit about the summary for policymakers, and I don't want to go through here, and you can look at these slides later, but it's most important is that it's unequivocal that human influence has been happening and that we're already affecting our weather. And we do see these extremes. And then the other thing that's important to note is that the uncertainty on what's going to happen into the future is getting smaller. So the models are getting better and their uncertainty is getting tighter. And finally, the last point, I just wanted to point out that we do need to limit our influence, and all hope isn't lost. That if we look at worlds where we have low or very low greenhouse emissions, there's still time enough to keep our temperature, global temperature, below 1.5 degrees C. But that's going to take a lot of work from everybody. So, but all hope is not lost. So I look at the IPCC reports and I think, okay, we've known this information for probably 10 years or at least, but we're still not doing anything. And it's really a policy and political decision that has to be done. And that takes place underneath the Convention Framework on Climate Change. And so this is the treaty work. And every year, this convention has what's called the Conference of the Parties. So the countries, the 192 people that signed the treaty, come together and work on solving the problem. There's a secretariat that oversees this process and manages everything. The IPCC information is fed into one of the two subsidiary bodies of the convention. The first one is a body that handles the implementation of the treaty, And then the other is the body that does this scientific and technical advice to come up with policies that can be used to address climate change. So this is just another way to look at it. So we have the overall treaty at the top with the member states participating, and then various different kinds of committees fall underneath that. And one of these is the working group on the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, we hear a lot about it, especially of the last administration pulling out. And this was the part where we decided we weren't going to participate in. But there's all these other things that we do participate in, and we never withdrew from them, like the Committee on Financing Climate, a Capacity Building Committee. There's a committee on loss and damage, one on adaptation, and then one on different sorts of mechanisms to help countries reduce their emissions. So we were still working and negotiating on a lot of the climate treaty itself. We just didn't do anything on the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is the part of the convention that is used to take over from where the Kyoto Protocol ended. So, and that was the first effort to address carbon market to reduce emissions. And the US was not part of that protocol. And so they decided they needed another way to address emissions and give people encouragement to participate. And they came up with this Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement was agreed to at Paris. So every time they have one of these agreements, it's named after the city where the conference is being held. So the Kyoto Protocol was in Kyoto and the Paris Agreement occurred in Paris. Had it been a year earlier, it would have been called the Copenhagen Agreement. So this is a way that they came up with, that every country decides for itself how it's going to reduce its emissions. And it makes a statement, gives the UN a statement and says, these are the things we're going to do to reduce our emissions by X% by some date in the future. And usually they're supposed to be submitted every 5 years, and the second was due in 2020. But because of COVID, things got delayed, of course. And also we were not in the US wasn't withdrew from this until the beginning of the Biden administration. So the latest statement, they're called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, and ours was submitted in March, about the time of Biden's climate summit. And you can find it online under the UN's climate website. I put the link in there. And so you can go read it. There's a lot of hand waving in it, to say the least, but it does give us a goal to work towards. So in the first NDC that the US submitted under Obama said that the US would reduce its emissions by 28% below 2005. So to reach that level in 2025. In reality, though, by 2018, we'd only reduced our emissions by 12%. So we still have a ways to go on even meeting that goal. The new NDC from the United States says we'll reduce our emissions by 50% below 2005 by 2030. So it's much more ambitious. And currently, the climate envoy, John Kerry, is going around the world trying to encourage different nations to be more ambitious with their NDCs, just as the US has done. So how this is just a timeline of how that compares to the two NDCs compared to each other. So you have this steeper slope, the green line under Biden versus what Obama submitted in the Obama administration. So we're trying to get there. We'll just have to see. There's a lot of words in it that speak about how local, state, and the federal government will work together. Private companies will have partnerships, private-public partnerships that will reduce emissions, etc. So in the US, the executive department has several ways it can change regulatory rules to address climate change, such as the Clean Air Act, the Energy Policy Act, and then the Energy Independence and Security Act. Under these acts, like fuel standards can be addressed, building sector emissions, power plants, methane, HFCs. So there's ways that even if you don't have a Congress that will work with you, there's still some regulatory rules that can be used to address climate issues. Luckily, right now we have a Congress that might be favorable to actually put some stronger legislation into place so they won't get overturned by a new administration. And that's always the risk you have when you have the regulatory path. But along with this, there's all this other verbiage in the NDC that talks about how much local governments and state governments, et cetera, need to do also. So how does this work? So the Paris rule book, which would put these NDCs into place, was supposed to occur in 2018, and it hasn't been finalized yet. So we hope this year it will be. So once an NDC is submitted, then in halfway through the next 5 years, the UN does what's called a global stock take, and they look and see what the emissions are around the world and who needs to do what to reduce their emissions, and that gets fed into the new NDC. And this cycle then occurs over and over until 2050, when we hope we have net zero emissions. There's a couple of problems, the sticking points with the Paris Agreement. One is called Article 6, which is the market mechanisms. This has to do, how do you put the market mechanisms together? There's a part that deals with bilateral mechanisms, an international carbon market. And one thing I wanted to say is that the US's NDC says explicitly that we will not be using or participating in the carbon market. And that's been consistent since Kyoto. So, and then there's a third part that has to do with cooperation on other things such as foreign aid. And they're all unresolved at the moment. For example, the different countries have different opinions on what's called double counting. That is, you don't want country A to count the same credit from the same project as country B, even if you did provide the money for that project. Things like defining whether a project is inside or outside NDC. One of the important things is to make sure that the overall mitigation at the end of this process is zero, and that you're not creating a credit that is not actually a true credit. Sometimes some of these credits, some projects like the carbon storage things, they'll claim the credit, but then they'll use that stored carbon for something like pumping out more oil. So you don't want something like that. And then also there's language that a lot of NGOs want approved, is that there's a specific reference that a country's project to reduce emissions won't hurt that country's human rights, and you're not stepping on human rights. And whether or not that they'll get into is a big discussion. And then the other thing is looking at what's called common timeframes. This is how often these NDCs are submitted. Some countries like the US, some small island states, some less developed countries want 5 years. There's countries like EU and Japan who would like 10 years because that's how they do their other planning for other things. So there's a lot of discussion on how you get some consistency around that. So what to look forward for this current COP. So the next conference, the political discussions, will happen in the first 2 weeks of November in Glasgow. One should look for that a lot more countries increase their ambition in reducing their emissions in their statements that they give to the UN. It would be great if the Paris Agreement was completed, and that be agreement on Article 6 and this common timeframes. And also it would be nice to see a stronger agreement among the parties to say that we won't exceed 1.5 degrees threshold. Right now it's kind of like, oh, we hope we will, maybe sometime, but it would nice to see a much stronger statement about that. And then also it's important to see foreign aid increase to the lesser developed countries to help them meet their mitigation and adaptation goals. And then finally, the fifth one, which it doesn't fall under the conference, is does the US fulfill its NDC in the next 5 years? So if you sort of are watching what policies and regulations are put into place, will that actually lead to reduced emissions and fulfill the statement that we've made? So one last slide. How could you participate? You can participate in the Conference of the Parties for next year. It'll be somewhere in Africa, probably November, December timeframe. That's when they usually are. I usually send out information about it in March, April timeframe. And this year we have 10 people participating, and I would think that we might be able to have 10 in the following year. There's also 2 different Google groups the National League runs. One is the UN group, and then the one on climate change, which some of you may be a part of. And I usually put the information and summaries of what happens at COP on these Google groups, and also notification of when people can apply to participate in the event. And finally, you can watch a lot of what goes on at the UN through their own streaming service, either live or videos of events. So they have a lot of videos that are available at the UN. So with that, I will take questions.
Oh, that was excellent.
We do have one question in the chat from Candace. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it, Candace, or should I read it?
I can see it. It's what makes the poles heat up so much more than the rest of the globe. Well, part of the reason is just the way the sun changes positions. And in addition, there's the added feedback that the ice provides into the atmosphere. So there's a feedback process that's happening on the globes at the poles too. but the Arctic region is warming much faster than even the Antarctic.
Is that because one is on land and the other is on water?
That's part of the reason, yeah. Yeah, the other thing to note is that, so when the ice melts at the Arctic region, it's not going to contribute that much to global sea level rise, whereas because if you're shedding ice off of land, you're adding mass to the water, and that's going to increase sea level rise. So
I wanted to make a comment too, when you were talking about the United Nations and the OPCC. And some of you might remember in 2007, the United Nations and Al Gore jointly won the Nobel Peace Prize. And our league worked with the United Nations Association of the East Bay to hold a joint meeting of several hundred people at International House on the Berkeley campus. And we had several speakers, but the keynoter was Dan Kamen, and the link was, what does peace have to do with the United Nations and climate change? So it fed right into what you were telling us about your work with the UN having to be under climate change, having anyway, that was the main thing that I wanted to say about it. Michael has something to say.
oh, the trustee council. I don't know a whole lot about the trustee council. I was going to look it up before because it was on the slide, and I never like having things on the slide I don't know a whole lot about, but that one I forgot to look up. And I don't know if I've never quite understood what their role is with the UN, so I'm sorry.
Do you know, Mike?
No, I was just curious about it because the public trust doctrine is increasingly important in law. And Donald Trump wanted to do away with it. And the legal profession seems to be in a hurry to give it away as long as they get their legal fees. And
Oh, right.
it's a very important thing in terms of, well, international law. Because the public trust doctrine has been made constitutional in several countries, and we've had it in common law, but our government's chosen to ignore it. And I was just wondering if you had come upon anybody in the climate adaptation world that was investigating that at all.
Thank you, Candace, for the link.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You turn video on.
Any other questions or comments?
What about uncertainty? Who makes judgments about what's uncertain and what's certain?
So it's a scientific calculatable quantity. The words, there's been a long history of what words to use to describe the level of certainty that scientists have in the outcomes that they produce from either data or these models. and where you break it between what they call high certainty or medium or low. I think it's a long discussion that the people who write these reports have tried to come to terms with. And I don't know. I mean, you can be 95% certain something will happen, so that would have a high value, but there's always this break point between high and medium certainty. So, I mean, one thing just to realize is that the spread among the various models that are looking out into the future is much, much narrower than it's ever been. But the results are not, the overall sense of what will happen in a warmer climate. It hasn't really changed since the 80s, or at least the early 90s. So you get less and less of the models that are really far outliers. One of the things I can say about models is, and the running into the future, is that the climate models right now are having difficulty with precipitation and including precipitation in the models and getting that right. Some of them are having a difficult time even producing past climates. So the precipitation is the one area where the science is more uncertain about what will happen in the future than, say, temperature. I think that temperature is probably an easier quantity for the models to get right. Then it's
Has anybody asked the question of how deep the water has to be before it's acknowledged to be water on sea level?
How deep the water has to be before
It's acknowledged to be rising. Because this is absurd, you know. Obviously, you know what the lawyers do. I mean, does this have anything to do with law?
well, the laws are how do we address them and things like that. But for sea level rise, you're looking at how far the surface is going up or down. It's not, and that includes the whole water column all the way to the bottom of the ocean. So you're looking, different parts of the ocean will warm or cool at different rates and at different places. But when you're looking at sea level rise, you're looking at if the surface is going up or down. So you're looking at the water column from the surface all the way to the bottom of the ocean. Does that help?
No, because what you see in your front yard is very different from any scientist's evaluation. And I mean, in terms of credibility, you know, if people are going to trust their governments, well, they've got to obey the laws, right? And it just seems that the scientists and the lawyers don't want to do that. They just want to talk.
Well, I think the scientists are doing their science. And the science is not, you know, law can follow science or not follow science. But I think I'm just missing the point here, or the question. And I'm having difficulty hearing what you're saying too. It's
Can I make a comment? I would
Sure.
think that it's possible that you would have more trouble with water than you do with some of the other things, because some of the things that we're seeing are changing are not things that anybody predicted might change. For instance, you don't see like the jet stream going through the middle of the United States, 20 years ago. And so the scientists probably haven't gotten a lot of the data they need to figure out why this is happening now.
Well, the problem with the precipitation is that it's very difficult to model clouds.
Right.
And especially difficult when you're looking at the scale. So you can, if these models, because they're all based on a grid. So if you have a cloud that is covering a 10 kilometers square or 100 kilometers, that's missing a whole lot of physics that's going on in that cloud and the fine scales. And so there's a lot of approximations that go on, and getting that right is difficult. So
I have a question also, which is a little bit different. We've had some catastrophic fires. There was the fire in Australia, and then there's all these fires across the West and the heat domes, but especially the fires. How is that taken into consideration? Because that wasn't, is that mentioned in what happens when we lose all those trees, which are heat sinks? And
right, so the land model, there's atmospheric models, ocean models, land models, and the land models do take in loss of, there's also loss of forests from chopping them down for
Right.
farms or whatever. So they'll try to take all of that sort of thing into consideration when they do these things. I don't model land, so I don't exactly know how they do it, but they do make some assumptions about certain things. And, it may be that they have to change some assumptions and build in some things because they know fire is occurring more.
And what about with loss of habitat? How much do they take the biodiversity issues into account?
For the physical basis, these models don't include that, but there are other people that do that work. So how it works is, if you're looking at the biology sort of thing, is that they'll take the information that comes out of a climate model, say 10 years in the future, as to what the temperature and precipitation, et cetera, will be, and they feed it into a model of biology. So.
Are people in the model?
There are different, they're not in these physical models. There are models of economics and social aspects of things. And I don't know much about those at all. There's probably more assumptions that go into those sorts of models than into the physical ones, because we actually have a lot of rules and we understand the physics, whereas it's very difficult to model people.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm wondering. Of course, everybody else is wondering. Now, I guess the fear factor has ramped up a lot thanks to the great work of the scientists, the modelers. It seems as though there must be some calculation as to the anticipated costs and how that will drive political and business considerations. I know that's really not probably not something that anyone wants to address in public.
But
But, you know, that's
do.
really,
They do. So when you,
okay.
these reports that come out next, the mitigation one and the adaptation one, look for that kind of information in those reports. Because those reports will include that sort of information.
Do you have some sense of the direction that we're going in? You know, the public, I think, feels that we've gotten to the tipping point, and people who were previous, or entities which were previously uh, discounting any need for action, are changing their minds. But, you know,
I'll give a personal antidote. My brother, who
okay.
lives near Auburn, so just east of you guys, he's put solar panels on his house. He's thinking about buying an electric car, and he's a big Republican, and he used to work for the oil industry. So my goal was, if I can change my brother's opinion and get him to move in the right direction, then there's hope. So.
I suppose he might be even more convinced after the fires that were just southeast of him just recently.
Well, he actually put his panels on before that, but
No, I know,
he
but
realizes too that that is also a problem. Yeah.
Right.
A little anecdote about the League of Women Voters, BAE, Berkeley, Albany, and Emeryville, and the United Nations. For many years before our league went to its present offices on San Pablo Avenue, we had offices in what used to be a co-op, at which then was in Andronicos on University Avenue. And in the back, there were some offices there. And the league's office was up above, and right sort of almost below it was the United Nations of the East Bay's office. So we used to, you know, they were our neighbors. We worked in close cooperation with them. And now we have neighbors in our present office, which are the Sierra Club of the East Bay and the Golden Gate Audubon Society, among a number of others, and the Ecology Center. So for someone who works on environmental issues, this move with all those organizations, right, sharing the building has been very, very good for us.
Yeah, good collaboration.
Yes, and sometimes it is. Do we have any more questions?
Oh, I don't.
Yes, Kate.
Hold on. I am mute.
No, we heard you. Now you're mute. We could hear you before. Not yet.
Yeah.
Touch the little.
All right.
There, you got it.
There is this a level of confidence that scientists may have in the predictions that they make about what's going to happen in the future, and when we'll be at 1.5 or when we'll be at 2.0. And I believe that is sometimes I think it's very significant, because when the IPCC report comes out, the farther out, the lower the level of confidence usually.
That's correct, right.
And I think that there's been this increase in the level of confidence. And that is kind of like when the doctor asks you, on a scale from 1 to 10, what is the intensity of the pain that you experienced? And, you know, you're the expert. because you experience it. So the scientist is the expert in his particular or her particular field. And over a period of time, this level of confidence rises or falls. I mean, it could. So I was rather surprised that there was only a 1.5 in your chart. It seems very unrealistic to me from what I've
You
been.
think that that it's too low, or?
Yes. Oh goodness, yes.
Yeah.
Well, what they said in this last report is they think if we cut our emissions quite a lot, so we have a very low emissions of carbon or super low, that we can keep under 1.5 degrees global temperature rise.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
we don't do that, then we won't. So
Yeah, I'm thinking of those charts where, you know, we are unable to do that really excellent.
yeah, and
Yeah,
I think they're just these reports are just saying this. If you do this, then this will happen. So they're saying if you can do this, we'll keep it underneath 1.5. But how we do that and can we do that is a separate question outside the science. So that's the political question. And whether, so you're sort of asking how confident are we in our political representatives and making the right choices to get to 1.5. The scientists are saying, yes, we can if we do these things, but, and they have high confidence that if you do these certain things, you can reach that, keep that level, that threshold, below that threshold. But the confidence in the political decision makers is maybe we don't have that much confidence in them actually making the decisions that will lead us to that point. If you see what I'm trying to say.
yeah, no, that makes sense. The thing I worry about with the climate disruption that we have, and particularly as you see the forests, does it Carol mentioned the forest going up in flames and losing, you know, all that carbon being emitted. It would seem to me that's I don't know if the models have that feedback loop. And there are many there's not just.
I don't know how if they've changed. I mean, the science and what they include in models changes all the time. And so there may be some people that are trying to look at that specific problem to see how it affects certain things. So
Yeah.
I'm sure, especially after the past few years, that is being looked at. The thing that's in the report now is from the studies that were done in the previous 5 years or maybe 10 years. So they're not it's not up to date with what everybody is doing. So hopefully the scientists are looking at that sort of problem and saying, well, yeah, we missed that point. We need to address it now.
So what's happened between 1992, when people were making this commitment to 1.5, and now? I mean, what are the figures?
I don't have them. I think the carbon just keeps going up. So,
but the temperature, what is the average temperature? Yeah, I mean, it's more than 1.5, right? Already.
No, it's not over 1.5. It's like something like a degree, I think, degree centigrade or Celsius, whichever you like. So that's 1.5 is about 2.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're certainly over a degree Fahrenheit average temperature rise around the globe. It's just put pressure on the politicians, and that's my message. And
Yeah,
we just hope that John Kerry is doing a good job when he's trying to convince places like China and the Arabian Peninsula countries, etc., to make some good choices.
it's like the Voting Rights Act and LBJ, before it finally, got passed. Somebody came to him and said, what can we do? And he said, you have to make me pass it. And, you've got to put loads of pressure.
Well, given the recent things that happened with flooding and the hurricanes and droughts, and these are affecting people across a wide spectrum of political opinions. So maybe that's what it's going to take to push people. I mean, even if you're rich, you can get your house can flood or get hit by the hurricane or whatnot. So, but there's look and see what happens with this infrastructure bill and the what was the reconciliation bill coming out of Congress. And I hope you guys don't recall Newsom.
Well, we have increased
Oh,
confidence
oh,
that won't happen.
Yeah.
it can't. It'd be terrible.
I mean, California is doing a pretty good job
So,
so far.
Can I ask? I don't want to put you. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot, and I think it's great that your brother
Oops.
Ruby, you're
putting
freezing.
solar panels on his roof and getting clearly. Oh, yes, that happens. Okay, sorry. There's nothing I can do about it. So the question is, of the big picture policy choices, as opposed to the individual choices. For example, in California, we have the carbon offsets for businesses, especially big businesses, to appear to be doing something. Of course, they could do more, according to the more active environmentalists. So, we have a choice then of types of strategies that we can support or not. And of course, then it becomes a lot more difficult to decide what to put your votes, what to vote for or campaign for. And if you don't want to answer, that's okay.
I don't.
Things
I
like
think it's going to take a lot of different things. I think about what kind of policy should be in place so that everybody can buy an electric car, or can use public transportation. I mean, it's going to take if we just got that part done, that would be a big step. But how it gets done, I don't know. So then you're using all these other bits to help. I mean, just getting the infrastructure in place so that everybody can, if they have an electric car, they can have the ability to charge it. It's just getting that switch over is just huge in my view. And a lot of people just wave it.
I think it's problematic also because I think things like the fact that, the state of California actually has used up most of the places where you can put up windmills to actually generate electricity. And okay, you can put, solar panels on your roof, but how do you make that so that it actually lasts for 24 hours rather than the few hours that it's sunny? There's still stumbling blocks in actually getting to having enough of the renewables for the level of population of a particular state, for instance.
I mean, one big step is to put a price on carbon. And then at least people would understand how much they're using of that. And I don't see the Congress doing that just
No.
because of the makeup of Congress, so.
It is 9 o'clock and we have actually filled up our time with information and questions, and we thank you so very much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome.
We applaud you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you.